Hey everyone, we are back working on the Vampire Hunters, and what I want to do in the final two videos is kind of go over a bunch of different recipes. So I want to do the non-metallic metal in this one, all the different non-metallic metals, and in the final video we'll do all of the leathers and the wood textures. So I think the reason the non-metallic metals are interesting on this is all the different temperatures. So you can see here on the shoulder we did already the intense orange colour, and then we have a more normal silver on the other side and a really blue one on the back. And basically I had to come up with a bunch of different recipes because there was kind of three different light situations for the silver. So yeah, I think I used 4 different types of silver in the end. She's got a little bit of yellow as she's standing away from the fire, but I still needed to include it. Then if you look on the top of her, you can see there's a slightly different recipe with a bluer colour at the back of the shoulder pad. So in a nutshell, I needed to do a cold silver non-metallic metal, and I also needed to do a warm one near the fire. And this was interesting to do, and I learnt a lot, and I'm hoping I can teach you some interesting stuff doing this video. I want to try and make these videos useful for any kind of miniature. I think not all of you will actually paint these miniatures, so I'm just trying to talk about stuff you can use in general for anything. I'm also aware we're doing quite a few tutorials on these same figures, and that's because they took me so long to do. I kind of need to get some good videos out of them, but actually they've come up with such interesting subjects. So I hope with this kind of non-metallic metal recipe video and then finally the leather recipe video, you've got loads of cool information you can use for a bunch of stuff. But yeah, I hope you like the results. Looking from above here, you can see all the different colours of the shoulder pad, and actually I'm really happy with that, especially the yellow. This was really interesting to me, and I definitely got better at doing silver, and silver's something I'm not as confident as doing something like gold. So yeah, I feel like I progressed quite a lot doing this exercise, and I'm hoping I can share some of that with you. So to make this less complex, I decided to use a central grey to kind of riff off of for the cold and warm recipes, and I chose this dark sea grey. I'm also going to use a bit of ash grey where I need it to be darker. But yeah, I used the dark sea grey, which has a little bit of brown in, so it's a bit more interesting. And I enhanced that with burnt umber to increase more of that brown in the shadow areas. One big discovery for me on my non-metallic journey was the use of brown to kind of make that iron looking silver, and I'm just putting a little bit of this burnt umber in, and it just enhances that, and I think it's really nice. And I also did the same for the ash grey, and I just mix a little tiny bit on the palette, as you can see, and burnt umber is quite powerful, but it's just the right colour for this. It's not too reddish, but it just adds that kind of iron feel into the steel. And when you do a normal grey, I think, it's lacking this kind of tone that you need. So the basic idea is I'm going to use dark sea grey as my middle tone to kind of go back to through all the recipes. And for the different situations, I'll add different highlight colours, slightly different shadows, but mostly just adding different highlight colours depending on where they are. And that means it's easy for me to go back to, and also not too stressful when kind of coming up with the recipes, because the silver needs to be coherent and feel like it's the same silver, but under, different environments and things like that. So I picked the sea grey because I thought it was the right feel in the middle, and then I'll just change it from there. So for highlights, I'm going to be using pastel yellow, and that's mostly for her sort of shoulder pad that's near the fire. And that's a really nice kind of recipe. And then I'm also going to use this blue grey for the cold side. So it's kind of ice yellow for the warmth and blue grey for the cold side. Blue grey, I discovered, it's a new colour. From AK for me anyway, and I love it for silver. It's just right. It's not too blue, but it was really a great colour for me. For a more neutral silver, then I'll just use this medium grey and white grey, so nothing too exciting. This is like a plain down the middle silver. Talking of straight down the middle grey, one thing I already knew but was really enhanced by painting these models was try to stay away from straight down the middle greys. You can absolutely do a amazing silver with just black and white paint, for sure, of course. But I do think it's a lot easier and looks nicer with some kind of tone in or some kind of variation. I think the reason for that is when we paint non-metallic metal, it's never going to look truly like silver. And I kind of learned that from teaching classes, and people are like, oh, it doesn't look like silver. And it never is, because you're using, these grey paints, so it's not going to look like silver. And people say, oh, but, this guy on the internet makes it look like silver, but that's a picture. Nobody's NMM looks like a true metal in real life. It just cannot. So what we're trying to do is just paint the information on our figures, make the person looking at it know that it is silver. That's all we need to do. Tell the person looking at it, this is silver. And one of the ways we can make it more convincing is by having colours around it, the environment, bouncing off it. And the reason for that is we kind of fill in the gaps. If we see that there's colour bouncing off something, then we know it must be reflective, and having that information there tells us that it must be silver or chrome or something like that. And that's why it's so important to include these different colours, I think. Once I discovered that, my non-metallic metals got better, but I still feel loads of room to improve upon when it comes to my silver. I felt like my gold's better, but silver is something I needed to work on. And actually, by the end of painting these, I feel better about silver. I feel like I know a bunch, and it just so happens that these models have the most variety of silver I've painted. And so there's no coincidence that I'm the happiest with it, because there's the most, variety of tones within that silver. Anyway, let me talk to you about the recipes I used. So on the palette here, I have all the colours I used, and in the middle here, we've got that dark sea grey. So for the cold recipe, I'm mixing the blue grey with the dark sea grey, and you just need maybe 1 or 2 tones to bridge the gap. And you can see that middle colour of them together is really lovely. Maybe it's hard to pick out on the camera, but it really feels like silver. It's kind of that transition from the brownish grey into the blue one is really wonderful. So we actually have a temperature contrast within this recipe. It changes from the kind of brown midtones into the blue. So you have loads of contrast within the silver as well as between the other silvers in the recipe. I do some highlights for the cold one with just plain old white mixed with the blue grey. You could go up to pure white, but I recommend getting some pure white and adding a teeny bit of the blue in as your final highlight, or even like an ice yellow or something like that. Like I said, lots of variety. So the warm recipe for the female character was really simple, because I just mixed dark sea grey with the pastel yellow. I actually added a tiny bit of peach with the yellow, just a small bit to stay away from that pure yellow. And that's because I wanted it to be, it's near the fire from the male character, but it's not super close. So that's why the recipe is less intense on the orange than I did for him. But it was really easy because I just kept adding some of the pastel yellow and then a teeny bit of peach if I felt I needed it. And you can see I've mixed kind of 4 tones here, and you've got loads of variation already. So this is all I did for that, and I'll show that in the process. But yeah, I just gradually added that to dark sea grey. So in terms of making the colours, really easy, but this was probably the recipe that looked the coolest in the end. And then the neutral one, you've just got these kind of, 3 greys you can buy. So you only need to do 1 mix, and I think that's to bridge the gap between the dark sea grey and the medium grey. Actually, that kind of white grey is a lovely off-white colour, obviously, and it's quite good if you can make things look silver. And this is the final highlight, so you stay away from pure white. There's nothing wrong with using pure white for highlights, but it almost leaves you nowhere to go. So I think try and put more shadows into it and then leave your final highlight as a colour. Will probably get more intensity and a more convincing effect. But a final highlight of pure white with a dot of pastel yellow is also really, really great. Before we go into the silver, I also need to talk about the gold. So the gold was a really funny one for me. I spent almost a whole day painting it and decided it needed to be silver. So when I finished doing the gold on the male character, it really overpowered it. It was too yellow, and part of that was the recipe I used, which was a different recipe, and I'll explain that soon. But also in my head, I planned doing it gold, but obviously non-metallic gold's kind of yellow, and all this yellow really took away from the intensity of the fire. It was just, yeah, the fire didn't have that kind of pop anymore because you just had all this shiny gold. So even though I spent ages doing it, I had to make a difficult decision to delete it and yeah, just paint it all again. And I don't have much time to do this project, so that was horrible, but it was the right decision. So what happened with the gold? Well, my usual recipe is this: Vallejo English uniform with Japanese uniform. I know this really well. I mix them together for the mid-tone, and then I add highlights to that color I've created. Now, I got this AK Japanese one, which looks the same. And the problem is it's much brighter, it's more intense, and when you're making paints, you probably think that's a good thing, but it really messed up my non-metallic metal because it turned out too yellow. And the other thing is I used it on its own. I should always mix a little bit of English uniform in to take away from the saturation. So it was more saturated than normal, and I didn't use English uniform, so that's why I ended up far too yellow. I think actually there's nothing against this AK paint, but I used pastel yellow and Japanese brown, and really what I should have done is, yeah, a little bit of English uniform, maybe some ivory, and that would have been a more desaturated gold. I'll show you the gold process anyway, because you might enjoy it. And here you've got my base coat of the English uniform. And here I'm just layering up the first highlight, which is the Japanese brown here. So I'm just hitting up the edges and trying to do a nice, clean, neat job. And I did. I was really happy with the result of the non-metallic metal. And that's why I want to show you the recipe, because it was really nice, but it was too saturated for this project, for this situation. And it took away from the main elements. So yeah, there was absolutely nothing wrong with the gold. I spent ages on it. It looked really nice in isolation, but it was detrimental to the feel of the project. So that's why it was such a hard thing to do. Actually, this little bit on the sword, which I filmed, was one of my favorite bits of the gold. So yeah, it was painful to delete. Here I'm highlighting with Japanese uniform and the pastel yellow mixed in, and you can already see the direction it's heading in. It's going to be a bit too vibrant. So yeah, a number of ways I could have controlled that Japanese yellow. One, left a little bit of English uniform in, which would have knocked it back a touch, and also started to add ivory. So pastel yellow is great for non-metallic gold, but it does keep things fairly vibrant because obviously it's quite yellow. Ivory will slowly desaturate it, and so it will just slightly change the feel of the gold. So yeah, I could have used ivory, and I think that would have bleached out the yellow a bit, and that would have controlled it as well. So here we're doing more highlights. I just gradually add in pastel yellow, finishing off with pure pastel yellow. And, you know, when I was in the zone, I didn't really think about it, but you can just see on the screen here, it's so yellow. It's way too yellow. And against that purple, it's just too much contrast. And there you can see, yeah, here, that, yeah, just too yellow. It's as simple as that. I'm adding the final highlights here, and it looks really beautiful. It's really nice and shiny. In the hand, it looked lovely. But yeah, just a nasty decision I had to make to get rid of this. But there you go, a nice, vibrant NMM gold recipe for you. Anyway, I ended up leaving the sword hilts, but I got rid of the rest. If you go back to the recipe I used on the vampire, it's way more desaturated, so that gold could have worked, but I just went with silver in the end. I think because I have the purple cloaks, then the contrast between yellow is even more enhanced, and you know, that's nice sometimes to have that complementary contrast, purple yellow, but yeah, too much in this case. Okay, let's do the silver, and here I've got my base coat of kind of, I think it's like ash grey with a bit of black or something, and what I'm doing here is actually going over it with some ash grey and the burnt umber that I showed you when we mixed it up, and that's so I just get that little earthiness and the kind of feel of iron into the shadows. Because I had a pre-highlight of white, that's why I painted it a little darker to start with. If you're going over pure black, I think you can go in with the ash grey plus the burnt umber as your kind of base all over. Start to plan my highlights now, and this is dark sea grey, and make these highlights large because you can add in some shadows later. So I kind of do a number of different highlights, one main one, then a small little one down the bottom. So at this stage, just kind of plan where your highlights are going to be. I've got that nice line down the middle of this shoulder pad where I kind of have the part facing up and then the part facing the down, and that makes it really easy to make some convincing non-metallic metal because you can have the changes of light on the different facings. And I'm also blocking in the crossbow here, and this I want it to be a kind of a much darker worn out steel than a shiny sort of silver on the armor, but I could still use this same first highlight with dark sea grey. Here we're working on highlight number 1, which is dark sea grey and a little bit of pastel yellow. So nice and easy, we're just going to gradually add in pastel yellow. So it's very easy to follow, just mix up your colours like I showed you at the start. And it's getting the highlight shapes correct that's difficult. So here both sides get this highlight, and as I get brighter, I'll probably stop painting one and just make the top surface really bright. I'm picking out those rivets and the details on the chest here as well as I go. Okay, same again, and I'm focusing on the top here, and that corner is really where all the light's going to be. So I do a little bit of a highlight at the bottom, but I'm concentrating really on that main part at the top. And you can see that sort of variation in color is already starting to look really nice. I'm doing a kind of side to side brush stroke to get a sort of brushed feel to it. So we're getting texture in the metal as well, but all the brush strokes will go the same way, as opposed to leather textures where it's random. It's kind of a texture, but it's all, in the same direction. So little vertical lines make it easier to layer up and get it smooth, but also give, subtle texture and feel. Okay, so at this point, we're not at pure pastel yellow yet, but it's starting to come through. So you can see I'm doing much finer highlights here. So a big area highlight at the top on the main highlight, and then I just do edge highlights with this color down the middle as well. So still not quite at pure pastel yellow, and I'm just adding a highlight straight down the middle here, really carefully hitting up the edge, and then just moving the brush down. And I'm really liking that subtle yellow tone. It's not too intense yellow. I feel like it's just right. Actually, this was the first time I tried this recipe, and at this point I was like, oh yeah, this is working. I'm enjoying this. Okay, so final step here, and this is the pure pastel yellow, and I think that is looking really shiny. And you can see eventually when we get to that pure color, that yellow really helps make it feel like a shiny silver, almost goldish, but next to the fire, that is just what I wanted. I think this one shoulder pad is my favorite bit of NMM on the model. So here I'm basically doing the same recipe, but I'm working on the chest, and I was thinking about, which parts get this recipe, and it was going to be, the shoulder, of course, the chest, and on the other shoulder, just the bottom corner. Luckily, I didn't need to use these clips because my head was in the way for half of it. But I just wanted to show you how much of the model I was covering, and I felt the bottom of the shoulder there needed this recipe. So I've got the yellow, but then the collar would kind of protect the other side, and I would use a different recipe, either the cold one or the more neutral one. And also, sometimes you need to paint it upside down, get comfortable to get nice and clean painting. But you can see where this NMM color finishes and the collar is protecting the other side. So hopefully you find that interesting when you're deciding, how much needs to be with this recipe. Now I'm going to repeat the process, but onto the cold side. So here I've already layered up the mix of sea grey and blue grey, and I'm adding in the pure blue grey at this point. And it's the same stuff, just changing the recipe here. It's key that it transitions nicely, but I think actually it's easier than you think. And now I'm just adding in the pure blue grey. Again, using just those little vertical brush marks so I can blend it in quite nicely and easily. And yeah, that's transitioning quite nicely from the yellow side to that because we used that dark sea grey for both. And I'll just start to add white to the blue grey, and that will finish off the cold side. This highlight's not going to be too intense because of its position, so yeah, I'm not going to go to pure white, but you can see it looks really good against the yellow. So comparing that slightly blue to the slightly yellow really helps with the non-metallic effect. I left the gold on the hilt, so I just got a little bit of English uniform and glazed that where it was kind of facing the silver. And I needed to go and blend that back in with some of the previous greys, but it's just showing you to include even more environmental colours. So you can see the cold grey highlight on the top we just painted, and then on the downside it's the same recipe, but I haven't done it as bright to represent the change in angle. And then I'm also including some reflection from the sword colour. So yeah, loads going on that one shoulder pad, but hopefully this makes it seem less complicated. And I'm just sort of finishing off with a little bit of a highlight here and hitting up some of the rivets. But yeah, there's a lot going on one shoulder pad in terms of non-metallics, but hopefully this video has helped you with the process and broken down and made it seem, I don't know, a little bit more approachable. But I'm happy with that whole area there. So much colour in one space, but we've kind of justified it with the sword being there and the flames. So yeah, a lot going on. After painting that blue-grey recipe with loads of success on her, this is where you can see I'm base coating over him with the ash grey, and God, what a shame to paint over all that gold. Oh, so painful. But like I said, it's for the greater good. So yeah, I was really happy with how that worked on the cold side of her shoulder pad. And so when I had that recipe down, then I decided to do it on him. On his shoulder pad at the back, that was me experimenting with some turquoise, and that recipe was a little complex, so I didn't want to use it, but I ended up actually leaving it on his shoulder pad. So that's why, if you're wondering why it looks so different, it's kind of was me practicing the NMM, and I've just left it really because it looks kind of cool, but yeah, the recipe was way too complex to actually use. And you can see on his right shoulder pad next to the wrist, that's me sort of halfway through. And I worked on all of his silver at the same time, but I just used the same method I used when I was painting her. The only real difference was his grey was facing that purple cloak, well, hers was as well, but I just included a little bit of Screamer Pink on the underside where I was facing that cloak. And you can see here I haven't painted the cloak yet, and you've already had the tutorial for that. But this is where I knew what colour it was going to be, so I could go ahead and include that environmental colour. I do subtle highlights by adding a little bit of grey and keeping some of that purple in there, but it doesn't need to be shiny because it's facing downwards, so it needs to be darker but still include that light. And that makes it easier and I think more logical, but you still need to have a little bit of that environmental colour, I think. Even if it's in the shadow, it's just not going to be like a full purple reflection. So I think that's it for silver in this video. So we'll just go back and look at the miniatures. Now I've kind of told you all the recipes. And hopefully you can see now, why I did what I did and how it works together. And most of the silver is in that cold recipe because it's only a little bit of the areas covered with the OSL. The crossbow, I did the kind of warm recipe because it was in the light, but I didn't push all the way to the pure ice yellow, nowhere near it, like I did on the shoulder pad. And I think it looks good. I also pushed the brown in the shadow, and I think that worked out well. And yeah, now I'm looking at the finished miniatures, especially through video. It was the right choice to get rid of the gold, and silver is something I'm not afraid of, but I'm like, ugh, here we go, silver. And yeah, I feel way more confident after this piece. And yeah, it was just interesting to me what worked, what didn't, how, which recipes worked out the best. And yeah, I definitely like her shoulder pads. I think that's some of my favourite NMM I've ever done. and actually making it more complex with different colors made it easier to look good, if that makes sense. It's kind of like, yeah, the more different nuances of tone going in, the more reflective it feels. So yeah, super interesting, and I hope you have found it as well. Like, yeah, like I said at the start of the video, I can't imagine many of you painting these miniatures in particular, so I hope these are just really great lessons you can use when experimenting other stuff. So hopefully you've learnt a bit about doing different colours. You've got some recipes to follow from me, but also you can maybe go ahead and plan your own recipes and do some stuff like that. I'd really love your comments on this one. It's a very complicated subject, and I've tried to make it a relatively concise video. I can see we're clocking in at 25 minutes, but I think for doing 3 different types of NMM silver, that's pretty good. So yeah, I'd like to know if you thought this video was alright to get the concept, if it was new information, if it was interesting information, and how you find, the pacing of all this stuff, because it's really important to me that I make painting accessible, and I love non-metallic metal, and I want to make it, more fun for people to try, because it is hard. But yeah, hopefully this seems a little bit more approachable after this video for you. In the next one, we're going to do something in the same vein, and it's definitely going to be simpler, but we're going to do all the different leather recipes I used, because yeah, there was all these bags and things. Actually, the leather drove me nuts because there was so much of it. But yeah, the final video will be very much in the same vein, where I go through a bunch of recipes I used for leather. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed explaining this one, actually. When I came up how I wanted to do this video, I was really excited by it because it's some fun concepts. So anyway, I'm going to ramble on even more if I don't stop. So I'll see you in the next one.